He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just looked at her, the woman who had given him 11 years of her life, and said, with the same voice he used to order dinner reservations, "Get rid of it. Not the baby, not our child. Just it." Elena Moretti stood in that marble kitchen, 10 weeks pregnant, divorce papers still warm from the printer, and felt something inside her go completely, permanently quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes before tears, the kind that comes after a person realizes they have just witnessed something they can never unsee about another human being. She nodded. She said nothing. And 3 days later she disappeared. What Damen Moretti didn't know. What would take him 8 months, a ghost sighting in the Arizona desert, and the complete collapse of everything he'd ever built to understand, was that she hadn't obeyed him. She had simply decided he wasn't worth arguing with anymore. If this story hits you somewhere deep, you already know why. Stay with me until the very end, because this one doesn't go where you think it goes. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because I promise you, the stories on this channel will find you right where you are. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning Elena found the photographs, she had been up since 4. Not because she suspected anything, not consciously, anyway. She'd simply woken with that particular restlessness that visits people in the years before they admit a marriage has hollowed out around them. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window watching the Chicago skyline go gray, then pink, then the sharp, cold white of February. She thought about nothing in particular. That was how she spent most mornings now, thinking about nothing. Filling the silence with small, manageable tasks so she wouldn't have to examine what the silence actually meant. Damen had left 3 days earlier for what he called a business trip to New York. He had stopped explaining his trips in detail sometime around year 4. By year 9, Elena had stopped asking. She wasn't looking for anything when she opened his desk drawer. She was looking for a pen, a plain, ordinary black pen, because the one in the kitchen had run dry and she needed to sign for a package. That was all. She pulled open the bottom drawer, the one he never locked because there was supposedly nothing in it worth locking, and there, tucked beneath a leather portfolio like they were hiding in plain sight, were 12 printed photographs. She picked them up slowly. Her brain moved faster than her hands. Or maybe slower, yet she couldn't tell. She registered the woman's face first. Young, dark hair. Laughing at something off camera with the specific ease of someone who doesn't know they're being adored and doesn't have to know because they already feel it. Then she registered where they were. The Peninsula Hotel, Chicago. She recognized the curtains. She'd attended a fundraiser there 2 years ago and specifically commented on the curtains to Damen, who had said, "Nice, I guess," the way he responded to everything domestic that didn't concern him. Then she recognized his hand, just his hand, at the edge of one photograph. She would have known it anywhere. She'd held that hand at her mother's funeral. She'd watched those fingers sign documents that built an empire. She knew the particular way his thumb hooked slightly inward when he was relaxed and unguarded. He was relaxed in that photograph. Completely, deeply relaxed. Elena set the photographs down on the desk with the careful precision of someone handling something that might shatter if she moved too fast. Then she sat down in his chair. She never sat in his chair. And she breathed. She didn't cry. She kept waiting to cry, and it didn't come. What came instead was something that felt strangely like clarity, like watching fog burn off a lake in the early morning, like finally being able to see the shape of the water. She had known. Of course she had known. Not consciously, not in the way where you look at someone and think you are betraying me right now, but in the body. In the way she'd stopped reaching for him in bed 18 months ago, and he hadn't said a word about it. In the way their conversations had narrowed year by year into logistics, schedules, household matters, the occasional dinner where they performed competence at each other across candlelight. She had known the way you know a tooth is going bad long before it starts hurting. You push on it with your tongue sometimes, at night, just to check. And then one day it just goes. She spent the rest of the morning organizing those photographs into a manila envelope. She didn't know why she did it that way, neatly, methodically, making sure the corners lined up. She supposed it was habit. 11 years of managing Damen Moretti's world had made her very good at organizing things that didn't belong to her. By the time he came home 4 days later, she had already called a lawyer. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine these things happen. There was no screaming. Elena didn't throw the photographs at him. She didn't cry or plead or ask him to explain himself. She was sitting in the living room when he came through the door, and she simply said, "Sit down, Damen." Something in her voice made him stop. She watched him recalibrate. She knew that look, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he was adjusting his read on a situation. He closed the door behind him. He set down his bag. He sat. She slid the envelope across the coffee table. He opened it without speaking. She watched his face while he looked at the photographs. 11 years of studying Damen Moretti's face, and she still couldn't always read him. But she read him now. Not guilt. She might have been able to work with guilt. What she read was calculation. The rapid, cold flicker of someone assessing damage and figuring out how to contain it. That flicker told her everything she needed to know about the conversation she'd been half hoping to have. The one where he said something real, something that cracked through the marble. He set the photographs down. He looked at her. And then he said the thing she hadn't expected, which was nothing romantic or terrible or dramatic. He simply said, "What do you want to do?" Like it was a logistics problem. Like they were discussing whether to renovate the kitchen. "I want a divorce," she said. "My lawyer will be in touch by end of week." He nodded once, slowly. "Okay." That was it. Okay. 11 years and the man had the emotional range of a legal document. She had expected somewhere in the hidden, stubborn place inside her that still wanted things from him, that he would push back, not beg. Damen Moretti didn't beg, and she had long since stopped wanting him to. But push back, show some sign that the dismantling of their life together registered somewhere in his body as loss. Show her she had been more than a well-managed asset. He showed her nothing. The papers were signed within 3 weeks. His lawyers were efficient. He was cooperative, almost disturbingly so, as if relieving himself of the marriage with the same brisk competence he brought to every other transaction. He moved out of the house. His name was on the deed, but he handed it to her without negotiation. And within 30 days, Elena Moretti was alone in a house that still smelled like him for another 6 weeks, no matter how many windows she opened. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday. She was 10 weeks along, which meant she did the math standing in the pharmacy bathroom, one hand on the sink. She had been carrying this child through the entire confrontation, through the lawyer calls, through the signing of the papers, through those 6 weeks of sleeping in the center of a king-size bed, trying to remember what her own body felt like when it belonged entirely to herself. Her first feeling was something she was ashamed of. Oh no, not because she didn't want the baby. The wanting hit her immediately afterward, fierce and irrational and completely at odds with every practical reality of her situation. She wanted this baby the way she hadn't wanted anything in years. It felt like finding something she hadn't known was missing. But then came the practical reality. Damen. She would have to tell Damen. She sat with that knowledge for 3 days. She turned it over. She examined it from different angles, the way you examine a thing you're afraid to pick up. She thought about raising a child alone. She thought about what Damen as a father might look like. Not the Damen she had loved once, because she was honest enough now to admit she'd loved a version of him that may have only ever existed in her own hope for him, but the actual man. The man who had looked at the wreckage of their marriage and said okay like it was a weather report. On the 4th day, she called him. He answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he was at his desk. He was always at his desk. "There's something I need to tell you in person," she said. "Can we meet?" A pause. "Is this about the settlement?" "No." Another pause, shorter this time. "Fine, tomorrow, 7 o'clock. She told him at a restaurant downtown, neutral ground, a place that was neither of theirs. She wanted witnesses nearby in the abstract sense, not because she was afraid of him, but because she knew herself well enough to know she needed the armor of public composure for this particular conversation. She told him plainly, no preamble. She'd learned in 11 years that Damen had no patience for preamble. "I'm pregnant, 10 weeks. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the living room with the photographs. That silence had been calculating. This one was, she searched for the word, arrested, like someone had reached into his chest and simply stopped something. She watched him very carefully. What she saw first was something that moved too fast to name. There and gone in the space of a blink, some reflex his face couldn't quite contain in time. If she had to describe it now, years later, she would say it looked like being struck. Not by fear, not by anger, by something that almost resembled the beginning of something human. Then it closed. The marble came back. And Damen Moretti looked at the mother of his unborn child across a white tablecloth and said, with a flatness that she would hear in certain quiet moments for the rest of her life, "Take care of it." She kept her face very still. "What does that mean?" His jaw tightened. "It means there's no place for a child in my life. You know that." "I know that's what you believe." "Elena." His voice had that particular edge, the one that had ended 1,000 arguments before they started. "This isn't a discussion." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about every version of this conversation she might have had. The one where she cried. The one where she argued. The one where she laid out the case for why he was wrong, why this child deserved better than his indifference, why she deserved better, why some part of him that still had a pulse should care about the fact that he had created a life with another human being, even if that marriage had collapsed around them. She decided not to have any of those conversations. She picked up her water glass. She took a small, measured sip. She set it down. "All right," she said. Something moved across his face. She didn't try to read it this time. She drove home, and she sat at the kitchen table for a very long time, and she thought about her grandmother. Connie Vale, 71 years old, living in a small adobe house 40 minutes outside Tucson, with a vegetable garden and 3 cats and more backbone than anyone Elena had ever known. Connie, who had raised Elena's mother alone after Elena's grandfather walked out, who had said, the morning of Elena's wedding, "He's beautiful, honey, but make sure you know who he is before you need him to be something." Elena had laughed it off at the time. She was 26 and in love with the idea of transforming a hard man through devotion, which is a story women have been telling themselves for centuries without it ever quite working out the way they imagined. She picked up her phone. She called Connie. "I need to come stay with you for a while," she said when her grandmother answered. Connie didn't ask how long. She didn't ask why. She just said, "I'll make up the guest room." Elena called Damen 2 days before she left. She had practiced what she would say, but what came out was simpler than she planned. "I took care of it," she said. "Like you asked." She heard him exhale. She couldn't tell if it was relief or something uglier. "Good," he said. "If you need anything—" "I don't," she said. Goodbye, Damen." She hung up before he could answer. She left Chicago on a Thursday morning in early April with 2 suitcases, her savings, and a pregnancy she intended to protect with every quiet, deliberate choice she had left in her body. She told no one where she was going. Not her friends, not her sister, not anyone in the sprawling network of Chicago's wealthy and connected that she had spent 11 years navigating alongside a man who would rather have burned it all down than show a single person he needed them. She drove toward the desert, toward her grandmother's house, her grandmother's cats, her grandmother's garden, toward a version of her own life that she hadn't visited in years and was only just now starting to want back. Behind her, Chicago shrank in the rearview mirror. Ahead of her, the highway stretched flat and wide and open, the way things only stretch when you finally stop trying to turn around. She pressed one hand to her stomach. Just briefly. "We're okay," she thought, though she wasn't sure yet if it was true. "We're going to figure it out." The baby, her daughter, though she didn't know that yet, seemed, for a moment, to press back. The first month after Elena left, Damen Moretti slept fine. That was the part he would never admit to anyone. Not to Marco, not to his lawyer, not to the succession of quiet, competent men who managed the machinery of his life. He slept fine. 8 hours, no interruptions, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a man who has resolved a problem and moved on to the next one. He told himself that was proof of something. Strength, maybe. Or at least the absence of weakness, which in his world had always been close enough to the same thing. He went back to work the Monday after the phone call. He sat through 3 meetings, closed a deal on a waterfront property in Milwaukee, had his usual lunch, black coffee, grilled fish, nothing complicated, and returned 17 emails by 4 in the afternoon. Marco stopped by his office at 5 with a bottle of good scotch and the particular expression he wore when he was trying to be delicate about something, which on Marco's face looked approximately like a boulder attempting ballet. "You doing all right?" Marco asked, setting the bottle on the desk with exaggerated casualness. "Why wouldn't I be?" "No reason." Marco sat down without being invited, which was one of 3 things Damen permitted him and no one else. "Just checking." "I'm fine, Marco." "Right." Marco poured 2 glasses without asking. "Because you signed your divorce papers 3 weeks ago and you look exactly the same as you did before, which is either impressive or genuinely worrying, and I haven't decided which." Damen picked up his glass. "Worrying implies I should be feeling something I'm not." "Shouldn't you?" Damen drank. The scotch was good. It tasted like nothing in particular. "She made her decision. I made mine. The situation resolved itself cleanly. What do you want me to say?" Marco looked at him for a long moment. Marco had known Damen since they were 19 years old, which meant he had 23 years of practice at reading the specific frequencies of silence that Damen used instead of honest conversation. He didn't push further. He refilled his own glass and changed the subject to business, which was always the safest territory between them, the ground they both knew how to stand on without slipping. What Damen didn't mention, what he barely allowed himself to register at the time, was that the scotch had tasted like nothing for 3 weeks now. Food, too. Not nothing the way things taste when you're sick. Nothing the way things taste when something in your brain has quietly stopped sending the relevant signals. He ate because the body required it. He drank because it was social. Nothing landed. He assumed this was normal. He assumed it would pass. He had never been particularly good at knowing what normal felt like from the inside. Sophia Reyes, that was her name, the woman in the photographs, called him in the 3rd week of April. He let it go to voicemail. She called again the following day. He listened to the message once, standing in his kitchen at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee he hadn't tasted yet, and what struck him wasn't guilt or longing or any of the feelings he might have expected. What struck him was how little he felt. Her voice was warm and uncertain, and she said things like, "I just want to talk, and I know the timing is terrible," and Damen stood there listening and thought, with the same flat clarity that had been following him around for weeks, "I don't know why I ever called her in the first place." That thought arrived without drama. It just sat there. He deleted the voicemail. He never called back. He never blocked her number either, because blocking required a kind of active emotional decision that he didn't have the machinery to make. He simply stopped. The way you stop going to a restaurant, not because anything happened there, but because one day you realize you don't actually like the food. What he didn't examine, what he would not examine for another 7 months, was why he had started in the first place. What he'd been looking for in a hotel room with a woman he barely knew, while his wife woke up alone in the mornings and stared at the Chicago skyline and thought about nothing. What particular emptiness had required filling, and what it said about him that he'd chosen to fill it the way he had, instead of what exactly? He didn't know. He had never been good at the question of instead of what. The empire kept moving. It always did. The Moretti operation didn't pause for personal recalibration. There were properties to manage, alliances to maintain, the constant low-grade diplomacy of keeping a dozen different power structures from collapsing into each other. Damen moved through it all with his usual precision. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The machine fit him perfectly because he had built it to fit, had spent 23 years shaping himself around it until the man and the mechanism were indistinguishable. But something had changed in the texture of his days, and he couldn't locate it precisely enough to address it. Meetings felt slightly longer than they used to. Decisions that once felt instinctive now required a half-second of unnecessary processing. He found himself once or twice, 3 times if he was honest, sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and no awareness of how long he'd been sitting there or what he'd been thinking about. He was not, he told himself, troubled. He was adjusting. These things happened. The nightmare started in May. Not every night. 3 times a week, sometimes 4. Always the same structure, though the specific content shifted. He would be somewhere familiar, his office, his childhood home, the house he'd given Elena, and there would be a door. And behind the door, someone was waiting. He never reached the door. Something always stopped him. A phone that needed answering, a voice that pulled him back. And then he would be awake at 2 or 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of his apartment. He'd moved into the Merchandise Mart penthouse, all steel and glass and deliberate emptiness, with his heart hitting his sternum in a way that felt unprofessional. He didn't tell anyone about the nightmares. He started getting up instead of lying there. He would make coffee and stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city below, at the grid of lit and unlit windows, at all the lives stacked on top of each other. And he would think, he would try not to think, but the thoughts arrived anyway, about Elena. Not with longing. He was clear-eyed enough about his own emotional range to know the difference between missing a person and being haunted by the shape they left. What visited him in those 4 in the morning moments wasn't longing. It was more uncomfortable than longing. Longing had a kind of warmth to it. This was cold. This was the specific discomfort of a man who is starting, slowly and against his will, to suspect that he has done something he cannot undo. He never let the thought complete itself. He was excellent at that, at feeling the shape of a thought approaching and redirecting his attention before it arrived fully formed. He'd been doing it since he was 12 years old, the night his father explained the family business with the calm specificity of a man describing how to maintain a car engine. Damen had learned, in that kitchen, that certain thoughts were not useful, that the mind, like any other instrument, required discipline, that men who felt everything were at the mercy of everything, and men who felt nothing were at the mercy of nothing. He had spent 23 years being at the mercy of nothing. He stood at the window with his cooling coffee and watched Chicago breathe in the dark, and tried to understand why it was suddenly starting to feel like a sentence instead of a kingdom. Marco noticed before Damen admitted it. They were in the middle of a meeting in late June, 6 men around a table, a disagreement about territory expansion on the south side that had been simmering for 2 months and was now approaching a boil. One of the men, a mid-level operator named Reyes, who had no relation to Sophia and whom Damen had known for 8 years, was making an argument that was factually wrong in 3 specific ways and irritatingly loud about it. Damen let him finish. That was normal. Damen always let people finish before he dismantled what they'd said. But then something happened that wasn't normal. Damen didn't say anything. He just looked at Reyes. Not with the particular silence he used for intimidation, which everyone in the room knew and feared. Just looked, blankly, as if Reyes was talking about something that was happening very far away. Marco stepped in. He said what Damen should have said and said it well, and the meeting concluded. Afterward, when the others had cleared out, Marco closed the door and stood on the other side of Damen's desk with his arms crossed, and the expression he reserved for things he'd decided he was going to say, whether Damen wanted to hear them or not. "What was that?" Marco asked. "Which part?" "You know which part." Damen leaned back in his chair. "I was listening." "You were somewhere else entirely." Marco pulled out a chair and sat down, which he hadn't been invited to do, and both of them knew it. "And it's not the first time in the last couple months, so I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an actual answer, not whatever you usually give me." Damen looked at him. "Are you sleeping?" Marco asked. A pause. "Some nights," Damen said. Marco let that sit for a moment. "Is this about Elena?" "No." "Is this about—" "It's not about anything, Marco. I'm fine." Damen's voice didn't sharpen the way it usually did when he wanted a conversation to end. That was the thing that made Marco genuinely worried. Not the flatness, but the absence of the edge. Damen without his edge was like a room with the floor slightly wrong. You couldn't identify the problem immediately. You just kept feeling like something was about to give. "You know she's gone, right?" Marco said. "Left Chicago. Nobody knows where." Damen went very still. "I know." "You know about the Marco stopped. Something in Damen's face had changed. Not much. A tightening around the jaw. A thing that passed through his eyes and disappeared before it could be identified. "Never mind." "Say it." "It's nothing." "Marco." The edge was back now, brief and hard. "Say it." Marco looked at him steadily. I heard she went through with it, the pregnancy, that she took care of it before she left. He watched Damen's face. My guy at the clinic couldn't confirm specifics, but she told me she did, Damen said. His voice was completely flat in a way that was different from his usual flatness. Flatter, like something pressed down beneath it. So that's what happened. Marco said nothing for a long moment. Right, he said finally. Okay. Is there anything else? Marco stood up. He looked at Damen one more time with the look he'd developed over 23 years of watching a man refuse to feel things. Not pity exactly. Something closer to the expression you wear when you see someone about to make a mistake they can't come back from, and you've already used up all your words trying to stop them. No, he said. Nothing else. He left. Damen sat alone in the office for 20 minutes before he moved. He sat with his hands flat on the desk. He looked at the wall. He thought, for the first time completely, without redirecting himself away from it, the thought that had been circling him for months. I told her to do that. And then quieter. She said she did. And then the one he couldn't look at directly. What if she didn't? He pushed back from the desk. He went to the window. He stood there, and below him Chicago moved and breathed and meant nothing, and the thought sat in his chest like a stone dropped in still water, and the rings kept spreading outward. He didn't hire anyone to find her. He made that decision deliberately and then second-guessed it approximately 40 times over the following 2 months. He had the resources. He had people who could locate anyone within 48 hours. He'd used them professionally for years, people who owed him favors, people whose entire business model depended on his continued goodwill. A single phone call. That was all it would have taken. He didn't make the call. He wasn't sure, if pressed, that he could have explained why. Maybe because finding her meant having a conversation he didn't know how to have. Maybe because some part of him was afraid of what she'd say. Or worse, afraid of what she wouldn't say. Afraid of the particular way Elena went silent when she was done with a person. He'd seen her do it to others over the years. He'd never been on the receiving end before the kitchen table with the photographs. Or maybe, and this was the thought that visited him last, the one he trusted least, because it was the one that made him feel the most like a man he didn't recognize. Maybe he felt, in some wordless animal way, that he didn't deserve to know. The nightmares continued. He stopped drinking entirely in August, not because of any moral reckoning, but because the alcohol had stopped working in the specific way he'd always used it, as a kind of white noise machine for the interior. It had started making things louder instead. He put the bottles in a cabinet and left them there. The empire kept moving. He kept moving. He showed up to everything he was supposed to show up to. He made every decision that needed making. From the outside, Damen Moretti was exactly what he had always been. Present, controlled, ruthlessly competent. From the inside, he was a man standing in a large, well-lit room, becoming gradually aware that the room was missing several walls he had always assumed were there. The trip to Phoenix was Marco's idea. A real estate acquisition, a portfolio of commercial properties that a legitimate developer had over-leveraged and now needed to liquidate quietly. Clean money, or clean enough, the kind of transaction Damen had been doing more of in the past 2 years, as he'd slowly, deliberately, begun shifting the weight of his operations toward things that could survive daylight. Marco had scouted the deal. The meetings were set. It was a 3-day trip, nothing complicated, the kind of business that didn't require Damen's presence at all, but Marco argued he needed to get out of Chicago for a week before the city swallowed him entirely. You look like a man who's been sitting inside his own head for 6 months, Marco said, in the car to the airport. That's remarkably poetic for you. I've been practicing. Marco didn't smile. Come to Phoenix, close the deal, eat something, look at a sky that isn't gray. Damen closed the deal on the second day. It took 4 hours. The sellers were motivated and the numbers were clean, and by noon it was done, and Damen had 2 days left in Arizona with nothing to fill them except the particular restlessness that had become his constant companion. He drove the second morning. He hadn't planned to. He simply got in the rental car with no destination and headed away from the city, because the desert at least had the decency to be honestly empty rather than pretending to be full the way Chicago did. He drove north and then east, through small towns with sparse streets, and the particular slow pace of places where people have made deliberate peace with a quieter life. He stopped for coffee in a town he didn't know the name of. A small place, the kind with 3 stores and a gas station, and a diner with its hours written on a whiteboard in the window. He sat at the counter and drank the coffee, which was bad, and didn't mind, and looked out through the plate glass window at the main street baking in the 11 o'clock sun. He saw her before he understood what he was seeing. She was on the opposite sidewalk, moving away from him, walking with the particular careful steadiness of late pregnancy, one hand swinging slightly at her side, the other pressed to the small of her back, the specific posture of a body carrying something precious and heavy and entirely real. Damen put down his coffee cup. He did this slowly with great care because his hands had started shaking. The woman across the street turned slightly to look in a shop window, and he saw her profile. And the shaking moved from his hands into the center of his chest, where it had no business being, and where it was also, unmistakably, completely right. Elena. 8 months after she had told him the pregnancy was over, 8 months after he had said good and meant it, or believed he meant it, or performed meaning it so convincingly that he had almost convinced himself. Elena. Alive and present, and unmistakably, visibly, enormously pregnant with the child he had told her to destroy. He stood up from the counter without deciding to stand. He pushed through the diner door without deciding to push. He was across the street before the thought caught up to the body, and the thought, when it arrived, was not the one he would have predicted 6 months ago. It wasn't she lied to me. It was, she's still alive. The baby is still alive. It wasn't, they're here. He said her name. She stopped. The pause that followed lasted 3 seconds and contained what felt like the weight of every silence between them. The ones over 11 years of marriage, the one in the living room with the photographs, the one on the phone when she said I took care of it in a voice he now understood, standing on a sun-blasted sidewalk in a town he'd never heard of, had been the bravest kind of lie, the kind that protected something from the person most likely to destroy it. Elena turned around. She was beautiful in the specific, unflinching way of women who have stopped caring whether anyone thinks so. Her face was fuller than he remembered. Her eyes were the same, dark and direct, and currently doing to him what they'd always been able to do when she decided to stop performing composure, which was see him. Not the empire, not the reputation, not the machinery. Him. She saw him now. And what he saw on her face was not fear and not rage. It was something worse. It was the flat, exhausted look of a woman who has already gone through every version of this moment in her head and decided how she intends to handle it. Elena, he said again. His voice came out wrong. Rough, like something unused. Don't, she said. Just that. Don't. I need to. I said don't. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She stood on that sidewalk in the Arizona sun with one hand resting on her stomach and looked at him with the full weight of everything he had asked her to erase, and said, "Whatever you're about to say, Damen, whatever version of this you've been rehearsing, I don't need to hear it. Not here, not now." I wasn't rehearsing anything. He hadn't been. He had no words for this. He had never been more without words in his adult life. I didn't know you were still... I know you didn't. Her voice didn't waver. That was the point. He looked at her. He looked at her stomach. The child he had told her to get rid of was in there. His child. 8 months old, probably, judging by the size of her, which meant it was real. It had always been real. He had told her to end something real and then gone back to his desk and his empire and his flat, tasteless scotch and his empty kingdom and his nightmares about doors he couldn't reach. And the whole time, who knows? He managed. My grandmother. A pause. No one else. Elena, He stopped. The thing he needed to say was too big for the middle of a public street, and also possibly too big for any container he'd ever been given language for. I was wrong. She stared at him. What I asked you to do, he said. What I said that night. He stopped again. The word wrong felt grotesquely insufficient, like bringing a Band-Aid to a building collapse. I had no right. Something moved across her face. Not softness, more like the expression of someone watching a man attempt to lift a weight they already know is too heavy for him and deciding whether to watch him fail or say something. "No," she said. "You didn't. I want to—" He didn't know how to finish that sentence. "I know what you want," Elena said. Her voice had something in it now, something iron-edged and exhausted and absolutely immovable. "And I'm going to tell you something, Damen, so listen carefully because I'm only going to say it once." She looked at him steadily. "This baby is mine. She's not a negotiation. She's not a leverage point. She is not something you get to decide about just because you've had some kind of whatever this is. A realization, a guilty conscience. I don't care. She." The word landed in his chest like a nail. A daughter. "I'm not trying to negotiate anything," he said. "Good." Elena's jaw tightened. "Then I suggest you get back in whatever car brought you here and drive back to wherever you came from. And we can figure out the rest of this later when I'm not standing in a parking lot in 100-degree heat and you don't look like you're about to fall apart on a public street." He wanted to say more. He had approximately 37 things he wanted to say, all of them inadequate, most of them too late. He stood there with his hands at his sides and the desert sun beating down on him like it had an opinion, and he looked at Elena, at the woman who had carried his daughter for 8 months in defiance of his most unforgivable order, who had built a life in the Arizona desert rather than give him the satisfaction of watching her suffer or the opportunity to do more damage. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, possibly longer, Damen Moretti did not know what to do. He said nothing. He nodded once. He turned and walked back to the car. He sat inside for a long time with the engine off and the heat building. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel. He thought about the door in his dreams, the one he could never reach. He thought about what might be on the other side of it. He thought about a daughter who was almost here, a daughter he had tried to prevent from existing, a daughter who had come anyway because her mother had looked at the worst order of his life and decided quietly, without dramatics, without a speech, to simply refuse it. His hands were shaking again. He let them. He called Marco from the parking lot. "Change my flight," he said when Marco picked up. "To when?" "I don't know yet." He looked out at the street. Elena was gone. The sidewalk was empty and white with heat. "I'm staying in Arizona." Marco was quiet for 3 seconds, which for Marco was practically a speech. "Does this have something to do with—" "Change the flight, Marco." Another pause. Then, "Yeah, okay." A beat. "Damen." "What?" "Whatever it is," Marco said carefully. "Whatever you're about to do, think it through first. You don't always think things through first." It was the most honest thing Marco had said to him in years, possibly ever. "I know," Damen said. He hung up. He started the car. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward the small desert town where his daughter was about to be born, and his ex-wife wanted nothing from him, and he had absolutely no idea what kind of man he needed to become to deserve to be in the same state as either of them. But he wasn't leaving. That much had calcified in his chest in the parking lot, hard and final, and not negotiable even with himself. He wasn't leaving, which meant that everything about the life he had built and the man he had decided to be and the empire that had eaten his entire adult life was about to be. He found a motel 8 miles outside of town. Not a good motel. The kind with a vending machine that took your dollar and gave you nothing, a parking lot that smelled like motor oil and old heat, and a bed that was fine if you didn't think too hard about its history. Damen Moretti, who had slept in $4,000 hotel suites for the better part of 2 decades, lay on top of the comforter fully dressed at 11 o'clock at night and stared at a water stain on the ceiling and felt, strangely, no impulse to call his assistant and fix the situation. He was here. That was enough for tonight. He was here and he hadn't left. He slept better than he had in months. He woke at 5:30 to the specific silence of the desert before sunrise, which was different from the silence of Chicago. Less absence, more presence, the way places that are genuinely empty have a weight to them that crowded places don't. He showered. He drove into town. He found a gas station with coffee that was marginally better than the diner and sat in the parking lot watching the sky go from black to purple to the particular burned orange of an Arizona morning, and he thought very carefully about what he was going to do next. He had no plan. That was the honest truth of it. Damen Moretti, who had not made an unplanned move in 23 years of running an organization that required constant, flawless calculation, was sitting in a gas station parking lot in a town he'd never heard of, with no plan and a daughter about to be born, and an ex-wife who had told him with complete clarity that she didn't need anything from him. The rational thing was to get a lawyer. Contact Elena through proper channels, establish paternity, negotiate visitation, handle it the way he handled everything, through structure, through leverage, through the architecture of systems that kept emotion from making things messy. He knew how to do that. He'd done it with everything else in his life. He sat with that option for approximately 45 seconds before he understood, with a certainty that didn't require analysis, that it was the wrong move. Not legally. Legally, it was perfectly sound. But the man who sent a lawyer to negotiate access to a child he'd once ordered destroyed was not a man becoming something better. He was just a man with better paperwork. He drove to Elena's grandmother's house at 7 in the morning and knocked on the door. Connie Vale opened it before the second knock, which meant she'd been watching through the window, which meant Elena had told her he was in town. The old woman was 71 and approximately 5'3", and had a face that looked like it had decided years ago to stop softening itself for anyone's comfort. She wore a blue house dress and held a coffee mug and looked at Damen Moretti on her porch, the way you look at weather you've been expecting and didn't want. "You've got nerve," she said. Not angry, factual. "Yes, ma'am." "She doesn't want to see you." "I know." "Then what exactly are you doing on my porch at 7 in the morning?" He hadn't prepared an answer for this because every answer he'd considered on the drive over had sounded either manipulative or pathetic, and he was trying, genuinely trying, in a way that felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable, to be neither of those things. So he said the only thing that was simply true. "I don't know where else to be." Connie looked at him. She had Elena's eyes, or Elena had hers, the same dark directness, the same quality of seeing things without performing the seeing. She looked at him for long enough that he had to resist the impulse to fill the silence, which was his oldest and most reliable defense mechanism, and the one he was least sure he was allowed to use anymore. "You drink coffee?" she finally said. "Yes." She stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, more like a withdrawal of a specific obstruction. He followed her inside. The house was small and dense with living, plants on every surface, books stacked in ways that suggested they were actually read rather than displayed, 3 cats that materialized from different corners and regarded him with the flat hostility of animals who make accurate character judgments. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something baking, warm and ordinary, in a way that hit him somewhere undefended. Connie poured him a cup and sat across the small kitchen table and said, "Elena's asleep. She didn't sleep well." "I'm sorry." "Are you sorry she didn't sleep, or are you sorry for the reason she didn't sleep?" He looked at her. "Both." Connie wrapped both hands around her own mug. "She told me what you said, what you asked her to do." She didn't look away. "All of it." "I know." "Then you understand why I'm not particularly interested in making this easy for you." "I'm not here for easy," he said. "Good." She set down her mug. "Because I've watched that girl carry this pregnancy alone for 8 months, and I've watched her build something out of nothing in a town where nobody knows her name or her history, and I've watched her be afraid every single day that you'd find out and come take something from her. And now here you are." The words landed the way she intended them to, without cushioning, without the kindness that might have made them easier to absorb. He sat with them. "I'm not here to take anything," he said. "What are you here for, then?" He looked at his coffee. He thought about the 23 years of answers he had ready for every question, the evasions, the redirections, the architectures of language he'd built to avoid being pinned to anything as inconvenient as a direct answer. He thought about how none of that had gotten him anywhere, except to a gas station parking lot at age 44 with a water stain on a motel ceiling and a daughter he'd tried to erase. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I'm not leaving." Connie studied him for a long time. One of the cats jumped onto the table between them and sat down like a mediator. "She's due in 4 weeks," Connie said finally. I know. You're going to need somewhere to stay that isn't whatever terrible motel you picked last night. He looked up. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not warm, not welcoming, but something more complicated than either of those. Something that looked like a woman making a difficult calculation and deciding, against her better judgment, to give it another variable. There's a rental on the next street, she said. It's available month to month. I know the landlord. She picked up her mug again. You'd be close, but not on top of us. Elena can decide what she wants to do with that information. He nodded slowly. Thank you. Don't thank me. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because my granddaughter has been carrying this alone for 8 months, and she deserves to have options, even bad ones. He almost smiled. He stopped himself because it felt inappropriate, and also because it would have been genuine, which was its own kind of unfamiliar. Fair enough, he said. He moved into the rental that afternoon. It had furniture, the way motels have furniture, present but committed to nothing. He brought in his single bag and stood in the middle of the main room and called Marco. Tell me about Vitali, he said when Marco picked up. A pause. Why are you asking about Vitali? Because I've been out of Chicago for 4 days and I want to know what's moving. He could hear Marco shift his weight on the other end of the line. That particular physical tells he had when he was deciding how much to say. Vitali's been quiet. Too quiet, honestly. He made a move on the Kowalski distribution last week, which is technically outside his territory, but nobody pushed back. Nobody pushed back because everyone's watching to see what I do. That's my read. And what does it look like I'm doing? From the outside, Marco's voice was careful. It looks like you've gone missing. Damen considered this. 6 months ago, a rival testing the edges of his territory would have demanded an immediate response, specific, visible, and unambiguous enough to function as both answer and warning. He knew exactly what that response would have looked like. He'd written that particular script so many times it had become automatic. He thought about Elena asleep in the house 8 miles away. He thought about a daughter 4 weeks from arriving into a world that was, in meaningful ways, shaped by the things he'd done. Let it sit, he said. Damen, let it sit, Marco. I'll be back in Chicago in 3 weeks. We'll deal with Vitali then. Another pause, longer this time. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Okay. Marco didn't sound okay. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you're running things. You've been running things effectively for a decade. Run them. He hung up before Marco could argue. He sat down on the rental couch that was trying its best and stared at the beige wall across from him and thought about Vitali. Victor Vitali, 58 years old, originally from Odessa, had operated in Chicago's underworld for 15 years with the patient, a cumulative strategy of a man who understood that empires were taken slowly, not quickly. He'd always worked adjacent to the Moretti operation, close enough to benefit from the stability Damen's dominance created, far enough to avoid direct conflict. He was not stupid. He was not impulsive, which meant the move on Kowalski's distribution wasn't accidental. Vitali was probing, waiting to see if the rumors were true, that Damen Moretti was losing his grip. Damen told himself he'd deal with it in 3 weeks. He told himself it would keep. He was wrong, and some part of him already knew it, but the other part, the part that was newly committed to not making decisions from a place of reflex and control, told the knowing part to be quiet. This was his first mistake. Elena came to him on day 3. He was on the porch of the rental at 6 in the morning with his coffee when he heard footsteps on the gravel path, and he looked up, and there she was. She moved differently than she had on the sidewalk, more deliberate. Her weight shifted to compensate for the pregnancy, one hand always in proximity to her stomach. She wore a yellow dress and no shoes, and her hair was down, and she looked like someone who had made a decision and arrived to execute it before she could talk herself out of it. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him. "Grandmother told you to stay," she said. "She offered me the rental." "That's her version of telling you to stay." Elena studied him. "You look terrible." "That seems fair." She climbed the 2 porch steps slowly and sat down in the other chair without being invited. He didn't comment on this. He went inside and got her a glass of water. She wasn't drinking coffee. He remembered that from the pregnancy books he'd found himself reading at 3 in the morning in the motel, which was its own private embarrassment, and brought it out and set it on the small table between the chairs without making a thing of it. She picked it up. She drank. She looked out at the desert morning. "I'm not forgiving you," she said. "I know. I want to be very clear about that. This isn't me deciding things are okay. Nothing about what you said to me is okay. Nothing about what you asked me to do is something I'm going to look back on in 5 years and think, well, that was a misunderstanding. I know that too. Then what are you doing here?" He looked out at the same desert morning she was looking at. The light was coming in low and golden, and the air smelled like something dry and clean and very old. "I'm trying to figure out how to be something different," he said. "I don't know if I can. I think it might be too late, but I wanted to be close enough to... I wanted to be here when she arrives. I didn't want her to. I didn't want the first thing she knew about her father to be that he wasn't there." Elena was quiet for a long time. He let her be quiet. He was getting better at that. "You understand what I'm risking," she said, "letting you near her, letting you near any of this." "Yes. You have enemies, Damen, real ones, the kind that don't care if there's a baby in the room." "I know. So how does this work?" Her voice was flat and clear and entirely serious. "Because I left everything, my house, my city, my whole life, to make sure she was safe. And if your presence here makes her less safe, then you being her father doesn't matter. I'll disappear again, and you'll never find us. And I mean that." He believed her. He believed her completely and specifically, and in a way he hadn't believed a statement from another person in longer than he could remember. "I'm handling it," he said. "You told Marco to let Vitali's move sit." He turned to look at her. "How do you know about that?" She looked back at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding how much to tell him. It was the same expression she'd used in the early years of their marriage when she was deciding whether to push back on something or let it go, and he recognized it now with a clarity he hadn't had at the time. The look of a woman doing constant invisible labor to manage the emotional weather of a man who didn't know he was creating weather. "I kept some of my contacts," she said, "after I left. I needed to know if you were looking for me." He absorbed this. "Were you watching me?" "I was making sure I was safe." A pause. "And she was safe." He turned back to the desert. A bird crossed the sky at the edge of his vision, moving fast and deliberate toward somewhere specific. "Vitali will keep for 3 weeks," he said. "Will he?" "He's patient. That's his whole strategy. So wait for the right opening. He won't move until..." His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Marco. Which meant it was early enough in Chicago that Marco was already at his desk, which meant it wasn't a routine call. He answered. "What?" Vitali moved. Marco's voice was flat and tightly controlled, which was the voice he used when he was delivering information that required Damen to not panic, so he was modeling not panicking. "Last night, he took the South Side operation, Kellerman's whole network, clean, fast. Our guys didn't see it coming." The cold that moved through Damen's chest wasn't fear. It was the specific chill of a man who made a calculation and knew it was a risk and made it anyway and was now looking at the result. "How many men?" 3 hours, 2 theirs. Nobody dead, but Kellerman's in a hospital and he's going to talk to whoever asks him nicely enough. "Pull our people out of anything connected to Kellerman. Tonight." "Already doing it." "Damen." A pause. "There's more." Elena was watching him. She'd heard enough. Probably everything, the way she always heard everything when she was paying attention, which was always. "Say it," Damen said. "Vitali knows about Arizona," Marco said. "I don't know how. One of our people maybe, or maybe he had eyes on you when you flew out. I don't know. But he knows you're there and he..." Marco stopped, started again, more carefully. "He knows why you're there." The temperature in the air on the porch didn't change. Damen's body registered it as having changed anyway. "He knows about Elena," Damen said. "And the baby," Marco said. "Yeah." Elena went very still in the chair beside him. He didn't look at her.
He couldn't look at her right now because if he did, he was going to see the thing he'd been afraid she'd feel since the moment he sat down on that gas station parking lot and decided not to leave. The look of a woman who trusted that he could keep them safe, discovering that she may have trusted wrong. Is he making a move? Damen asked. Not yet. He's letting you know he knows. That's the move. He's telling you that you have something to lose now. Marco's voice dropped. He's been waiting for this for 15 years, Damen. He's been waiting for you to have something he could use. Damen stood up from the porch chair. He walked to the railing and gripped it and looked out at the desert and thought, with a clarity that cut through everything else like a blade through smoke. I did this. I came here. I made her visible. I made her a target. I'll be back in Chicago by tonight, he said. Don't, Marco said. Marco. Think about it for 2 seconds. If you get on a plane right now, you're leaving them there alone. If Vitaly wanted to move on them before you got back, he'd have a window. You being in Chicago doesn't protect them. It just puts you in the wrong city. Damen's jaw tightened. Marco was right. He hated that Marco was right. What do you need from me? Marco asked. Send 4 men to Arizona. Tonight. People I trust, not people I manage. Actual people I trust, Marco. You know the difference. Yeah, I know the difference. A pause. And Kellerman? Kellerman is handled. Get him out of that hospital if you can, somewhere quiet, before the FBI decides he's more useful to them than to us. And Vitaly? Damen looked at the desert. He thought about Victor Vitaly in a Chicago office somewhere, patient and accumulated, watching the Moretti empire start to develop cracks. Waiting, letting Damen know he was waiting. Don't touch him yet, Damen said. Damen, I said not yet. He hung up. He turned around. Elena was standing now, both hands pressed to her stomach, watching him with an expression that had moved past the flat-controlled composure she'd arrived with into something raw. Not panic, not quite, but the thing that lives right next to panic in a person who refuses to panic. Tell me the truth, she said. Vitaly knows we're here. She absorbed this with one slow breath. Are we in danger? Not immediately. He's using you as leverage. He won't damage the leverage until he knows whether it worked. So he's going to threaten us. He already did. He moved toward her, stopped when he saw her take a slight step back, not from fear of him specifically, but from the reflex of a woman who'd spent 8 months building a careful, protected life and could now feel it beginning to shift. I'm sending men here tonight, people I trust. You'll be protected. Sending men here? Her voice had an edge now that he deserved. The same way you'd handle a business asset. No. He met her eyes. The way I'd handle someone I'm not willing to lose. The words sat between them. He hadn't planned them and he didn't qualify them, which was the only reason they landed at all. Elena looked at him for a long time. Her hands were still pressed to her stomach. The morning was getting warmer and somewhere across the desert, a bird was making a sound like something repetitive and persistent and unbothered by the complexity of human mistakes. I'm not leaving this house, she said. I'm not asking you to. And your men stay outside. My grandmother doesn't need armed strangers in her kitchen. Agreed. And you... She stopped. She was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, which was saying something because he'd known this woman for more than a decade. It was the look of someone doing a risk calculation in real time. Not the polished professional kind he did at a desk. The raw animal kind a person does when something they love is in the math. You stay, she said finally, like it cost her something. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She nodded once. She went back inside without another word. He stood on the porch alone and the desert morning expanded around him, indifferent and vast. And he thought about Vitaly and about Marco and about 15 years of someone waiting for a crack in his armor, and he understood with the specific clarity of a man who has just watched his past catch up to his present that the empire he'd spent 23 years building had just been used as a weapon against the first thing in decades that made the empire feel like it might not be worth it. He called Marco back. The 4 men, he said when Marco answered. Make it 6. Already on it. Damen. A hesitation that Marco almost never permitted himself. How bad is this? Damen looked at the door Elena had closed behind her. He thought about what was on the other side of it.
his daughter, 4 weeks from arriving. A woman who had refused to destroy something he'd told her to destroy, and had turned out to be the most important decision anyone had ever made on his behalf without his knowledge. "It's as bad as it needs to be to change everything," he said. He hung up. He sat back down in the porch chair. He drank his cold coffee. He waited for what was coming. It arrived faster than he expected, because it always did. The bill for the life you lived always arrived faster than you budgeted for. He'd known that since he was 19. He'd just always assumed that when it came, it would be his own life on the table. He hadn't imagined it would be hers. That was the thing about having something to lose, he understood now. Sitting on a porch in Arizona with 6 men on a plane and a rival who had waited 15 years for this moment. You don't know what you can lose until someone shows you they know where it is. Vitaly hadn't attacked. He didn't need to, not yet. He'd done something more efficient than an attack. He'd simply let Damen understand that the equation had changed, that the calculation now included variables Damen had spent his whole life refusing to include, that the armor he'd built, all that cold distance and controlled indifference, had not protected him. It had just delayed the moment when someone found the crack. The crack was a yellow dress and bare feet on porch steps. The crack was a daughter 4 weeks from taking her first breath. The crack was a woman who had looked at the worst of him and chosen, quietly and alone and without any acknowledgement from anyone, to protect something from him anyway. Vitaly had found it, and now Damen had to decide what to do about a man who had 15 years of patience and a reputation built on waiting, using the one vulnerability Damen could not negotiate away, could not leverage back, could not manage with the tools he'd spent a lifetime sharpening, because those tools required a man to care more about winning than about what he was willing to. The 6 men arrived at 2 a.m. Damen met them in the gravel lot behind the rental. 3 he'd known for over a decade. 2 he'd personally pulled out of situations that would have killed lesser men, one named Carver, who never spoke more than 8 words in a row, and whom Damen trusted precisely because of that. They came in 2 vehicles, nothing conspicuous, and they moved with the particular quiet efficiency of men who understood that their job tonight was presence, not action. He briefed them in 10 minutes. Perimeter on the house. Rotating shifts. Nothing moves without his knowledge. Nobody approaches Elena or Connie without going through him first. Carver looked at him when the others dispersed to their positions. "Vitaly sending someone?" "I don't know yet." "But you think so?" "I think he made the call to let me know he knows. That's a man who's about to do something with that information." Carver nodded once, the way he did everything, economically, without embellishment. "We'll be ready." Damen went back inside. He didn't sleep. He sat at the small kitchen table with his phone and his cold coffee and a legal pad that he'd bought at a gas station and proceeded to fill with numbers. Not the Empire's numbers, though those were in his head too. Always, the way certain music gets into you and won't leave. These were different numbers. He was mapping Vitaly's operation from memory. 15 years of parallel observation, of watching a man build something at the margins of his territory, of noting patterns the way you note weather patterns without necessarily caring about the weather. He knew Vitaly's operation better than Vitaly probably understood. He'd just never needed to use that knowledge because he'd never needed to fight a man whose primary weapon was patience. He needed to use it now. By 4 a.m, he had 3 pages of notes. By 5, he had a call into a federal contact he'd maintained for 6 years. A relationship of mutual, unspoken usefulness, neither of them naive about what it was. The contact's name was Reese, and Reese answered on the 4th ring, sounding like a man who'd been awake for hours already. "I need a conversation," Damen said. "About?" "Vitaly." Silence on the line. Not the silence of surprise. Reese wasn't surprised by anything at this point in his career. The silence of a man recalibrating a long-standing equation. "That's a significant conversation," Reese said. "I know. Significant enough that it changes the nature of our previous arrangement." "I know that too." Another pause. "I'm in Phoenix through Thursday. There's a Marriott on Camelback. Tomorrow morning, 7. "Fine." Reese hung up without goodbye, which was how Reese always hung up, and Damen sat with the phone in his hand and the legal pad in front of him and thought about what he'd just done. Not metaphorically, actually thought about it, walked it through from every angle, let himself feel the full weight of it. He'd made the first move toward handing his empire to the federal government. The thought should have felt like defeat. It felt, with a clarity that disturbed him, like the first honest decision he'd made in years. Elena went into labor at 6:15 the next morning. He found out because Connie knocked on his door at 6:22, wearing a robe and an expression that had set aside all of its complications in favor of pure practical emergency. "Her water broke," Connie said. "We need to go." He drove. Connie sat in the back with Elena, who was breathing through contractions with the focused, teeth-gritted discipline of a woman who had also spent 11 years managing herself in proximity to Damen Moretti and had developed extraordinary capacity for controlled suffering. She didn't make noise except when a contraction crested, and then she made a sound that was short and hard and immediately suppressed, which was somehow worse than if she'd screamed. "You're doing fine," Connie said, in the steady voice of a woman who'd seen this before and wasn't performing calm but actually had it. "I know," Elena said through her teeth. "I know I am." Damen kept his eyes on the road and both hands on the wheel and did not say a single word because he understood, with an instinct he hadn't known he possessed until this moment, that the only useful thing he could do right now was drive and not require anything from her. He called Carver at the first red light. "We're heading to the hospital. Bring 2 men. Stay outside. Do not come in unless I call." "Copy." He drove. He sat in a waiting room chair for 4 hours. He was not permitted in the delivery room. Elena was clear about that. Had said it before they left the house, looking at him in the back seat with the particular clarity people develop when pain removes everything unnecessary. "You wait outside," she'd said, not unkindly, just factually. And he had said, "Okay," because it was her call, and he knew it was her call, and he was trying, actively and consciously trying, to be a man who knew which things were his call and which weren't. So he sat. The waiting room had pale blue walls and a television cycling through a morning news program he didn't watch, and a coffee machine that cost $2 and produced something that tasted like hot water with ambitions. He drank 3 cups. He checked his phone every 12 minutes. He had 4 messages from Marco about Vitali, 2 about Kellerman, 1 from his lawyer that he didn't open. At the 2-hour mark, Carver appeared in the waiting room doorway, caught his eye, and gave 1 small shake of his head. Nothing external. Perimeter clean. At the 3-hour mark, Marco called. "Vitali's men crossed into Arizona last night," Marco said without preamble. 3 of them. They drove, didn't fly. We picked it up from a contact in Flagstaff." Damen stood up from the chair and walked to the far corner of the waiting room, turning his back to the television. "How far out?" "If they're driving straight, maybe 2 hours from your position." "They know the hospital?" "I don't know what they know. If they have someone inside your circle, there's no one inside my circle." "Damen," Marco's voice had the tone he used when he was about to say something that was going to land badly. "Vitali has been building toward this for 15 years. He's had 15 years to put people in places. That's not accusation, that's math." Damen's jaw tightened until it ached. "I'll call you back." He hung up. He stood in the corner of the pale blue waiting room and thought about 3 men in a car, 2 hours out, carrying Vitali's message in whatever form he'd decided to send it. He thought about Carver outside with 2 men. He thought about Elena in a room down this hallway doing the hardest thing a human body can do, while her ex-husband stood in a waiting room doing mental arithmetic about perimeter coverage. He called Carver. "I need the other 4 here, now." "You want me to pull from the house?" "Connie's not at the house. She's here. Get everyone here." A pause. "Vitali's moving?" "Probably. 2 hours, maybe less. Get everyone here and get them positioned outside. I want 2 at each entrance, 1 in the parking structure, 1 mobile. And if they come in hot?" "They won't. Not in a hospital. Too visible. Too complicated. They'll wait for us to leave." He paused. "Unless Vitali decides visibility is the point." "I'll get everyone here," Carver said. "Damen, you need to call Reese." "I know." "Call him now, before those 3 cars get any closer." He hung up and stood in the corner and made the calculation he'd been circling for 24 hours. Calling Reese now, before the meeting tomorrow, changed things. It meant going in with less leverage, less preparation, making the call from a position of immediate need rather than considered strategy. Vitali would say that was exactly what he'd engineered. cornering a man who'd never needed anyone into needing someone. Maybe it was, but the alternative was waiting for the meeting he'd carefully arranged while 3 of Vitali's men got 2 hours closer to a maternity ward. He called Reese. "The meeting needs to happen today," he said when Reese answered. "Now, if you can." A pause, long enough that Damen could hear Reese recalibrating everything they'd discussed the night before. "You're in a hurry. Vitali's moving. Today." "Where are you?" "Desert Valley Medical, maternity ward." Another pause. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. A beat. "Moretti." "What?" "Whatever you're about to hand me, make sure you mean it, because I don't do this twice." "I mean it," Damen said. He hung up. He sat back down in the chair. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and stayed there for 60 seconds, not long enough for anyone watching to notice, but long enough for something to move through him and leave. Then he sat up. He checked his phone. He waited. Reese arrived in 38 minutes in civilian clothes and sat down next to Damen in the waiting room with a cup of coffee he'd brought from somewhere else, which told you everything about what Reese thought of hospital coffee. He was 53, lean in the way of men who've been running on adrenaline and institutional coffee for 30 years, with a face that had stopped lying about its age sometime around the second decade of federal work. He looked like a man who had decided things, a lot of things, on behalf of a government that often didn't deserve that level of decisiveness, and lived with it. He sat next to Damen and didn't look at him and said, quietly enough that the nearest other person in the room couldn't hear, "How much?" "Everything," Damen said. Reese looked at his coffee cup. "Define everything." 23 years of financial records, the full operational structure, routes, contacts, offshore accounts, the political relationships, all of it. He paused. The alderman connections, the port arrangements, the Kellerman network in full, not what you've been assuming about it. Reese was quiet. He turned the coffee cup in his hand slowly. "That's a significant offer." "Yes." "What do you want for it?" "Protection for Elena Moretti and the child. Permanent, real, not witness protection theater, Bunke. Actual protection, handled at a level where Vitali can't reach it regardless of what happens to me or the organization." He paused. "An immunity for Marco Reyes. He's cooperating. He doesn't know he's cooperating yet, but he will." Reese looked at him for the first time since sitting down. Really looked at him. The investigator's look. The one that was trying to find the angle, the percentage, the play. "You're not asking for immunity for yourself." "No." "That's either very noble or very stupid." "Probably both." Reese looked back at his coffee. A child across the waiting room was crying, the ordinary, exhausted crying of someone too young to have decided how to manage being tired. And for a second, it was the loudest sound in the room. "The offer is real," Reese said. It wasn't a question. "It's real. I need to make calls. This level of cooperation goes above my authority to authorize on the spot." "I know, but I need something from you today, Reese. Vitali has men in the state. They may be at this hospital in an hour. I need federal presence here, now, today, before the paperwork catches up with us." Reese stood up. He took out his phone and walked toward the hallway and made 2 calls standing near the water fountain, his back to the room, his voice too low to hear. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, he sat down and said, "I've got 2 agents here in 20 minutes, 2 more at the perimeter. That buys you today." "And the rest?" "I need 72 hours to get the authorization. Give me 72 hours and I'll give you everything you're asking for Elena and the child." "And Marco?" "Conditional on full cooperation, but yes." Reese looked at him steadily. "You understand that when you hand me this material, you're ending the organization permanently. There's no restructuring, no plea that gets you back to anything resembling what you had." "I know." "And you're at peace with that?" Damen thought about 23 years. He thought about the house on Lakeshore Drive, the alliances, the empire his father had built, and he had expanded and refined until it fit him, the way a prison cell fits someone who's been inside long enough to think of it as home. He thought about a waiting room chair and a pale blue wall and a hallway where his daughter was being born right now without him. "I'm not at peace with anything," he said. but I'm done with it. Reese nodded. He stood up and was walking toward the exit when Damen's phone buzzed. Carver. He answered it fast. They're here. Carver's voice was flat and clipped. 3 vehicles, 6 men, east parking structure. They're not coming in. They're positioned. Reese, Damen said. The federal agent was still close enough to hear him. They're in the parking structure, 6 men. Reese turned around. His phone was already out. He made one call, said 4 words, I need it now, and hung up. He looked at Damen. Stay inside. I'm not going anywhere. I mean it. Whatever happens outside, you stay inside that building. My daughter is being born in this building, Damen said. I'm not going anywhere. Something moved across Reese's face. Not sentiment exactly. More like the expression of a man who has processed enough human complexity to recognize when something is genuinely not a performance. He gave one small nod and walked out. Damen sat back down. He sat with his phone in one hand and the awareness of Vitali's 6 men in the parking structure, and Reese's agents moving to intercept them, and Carver's team on the perimeter, and the whole accumulated machinery of his life converging on a hospital parking lot in the Arizona desert, and he breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way Elena had breathed through her contractions in the back seat, not to perform composure, but because it was the only useful thing his body could do while his mind held all of it at once. His phone buzzed again. Marco. He answered. Vitali just called me, Marco said. His voice had something in it Damen hadn't heard in decades of working with the man. Something close to shaken. Directly, he called me on my personal line. What did he say? He said, Marco stopped, started again. He said to tell you that he hopes the baby is healthy. He said it like that. Exact words. Tell him I hope the baby is healthy. That's the message. The cold that moved through Damen's chest this time was different from the other times. Not the chill of strategic calculation or the freeze of someone processing bad information. This was older than that, more animal. The specific cold that moves through a person when someone touches the thing they would burn everything else to protect. Did you record the call? Damen asked. Yes? Send it to this number. He read out Reese's number from memory. Right now. Don't call first, just send it. Damen, what's happening? I'll call you back, Marco. He hung up. He sat in that chair. The morning news was still cycling on the television. Somewhere beyond the pale blue walls and the vinyl flooring and the smell of industrial cleaner and the ordinary tragedy of a public hospital, federal agents were moving towards 6 of Vitali's men in a parking structure. And somewhere in this building, down a hallway he'd been told not to enter, a child was taking the first hard breaths of a life that her father had once tried to prevent. He pressed the back of his head against the wall. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about what cost. Not in money, not in power, not in any of the currencies he'd spent his entire adult life accumulating. He thought about what it actually cost. The thing you gave when you gave the only thing you'd decided was worth giving. The door at the end of the hallway opened. Connie appeared. She was still in the same robe, had never changed, and her face had changed since the parking lot. The practical emergency had softened into something else, something worn through to its foundation and quietly enormous. She walked toward him without hurrying. She sat down in the chair beside him where Reese had sat, and she looked at him for a moment, and then she said, She's here. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, Connie said, screaming her head off from the first second, which I personally consider an excellent sign. She paused. She has your jaw. He made a sound he didn't recognize from himself. Short and involuntary and immediately controlled, but not before Connie heard it and gave him the small, complicated look of a woman who had decided not to decide yet what to do with this man, but was at least willing to observe that he was human. Elena is tired, Connie said. Very tired. But she's asking for you. He went still. She's asking. She's not forgiving you. I want that to be clear. She told me to make sure you understood that. Connie stood up. She's asking for you anyway, because she said, and I'm quoting her directly, she deserves to have him see her. Connie looked at him. The baby. She deserves to have him see her. He stood up. His legs worked. He followed Connie down the hallway. Outside in the parking structure, he could hear nothing from here. No sirens yet, no commotion reaching this deep into the building, just the ordinary sounds of a hospital doing its ordinary work of beginning and ending lives. He didn't know what was happening out there. He would know soon enough. Right now, there was only the hallway and the door at the end of it. Connie pushed it open and stepped back. He went in. Elena was in the bed, pale with exhaustion, her hair loose around her face, the specific undone quality of a woman who has just done the hardest physical thing she will ever do and is now on the other side of it. She looked at him when he came in, and her face held all of its complexity. All 11 years, the photographs, the kitchen table, the divorce papers, the parking lot in Arizona, everything. And she didn't try to resolve any of it. She just looked at him. In her arms was a small, red-faced, impossibly alert creature who was examining the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone encountering existence for the first time and finding it overwhelming but not insurmountable. "Come here," Elena said. Not warmly, carefully. The way you extend something precious to someone you don't fully trust yet but are choosing to trust right now, in this specific moment, because the moment requires it. He crossed the room. He stood over the bed. He looked down at his daughter. She had Elena's eyes. Or they would be Elena's eyes. Dark, direct, built for seeing. She had his jaw, like Connie had said. She was 7 pounds and about 3 minutes old, and she existed in complete defiance of the worst thing he had ever said. And he understood, standing there in a hospital room in Arizona, with the sound of his own heartbeat too loud in his ears, that he was looking at the only thing he'd ever been part of building that he hadn't destroyed. "Hi," he said. To the baby. Just that. The word came out wrong. Rough and stripped of everything he would normally put between himself and genuine feeling. His daughter turned her head slightly, the unfocused way of the brand new, and her mouth opened and her fingers spread apart. Behind him, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He knew without looking that it was Carver, or Reese, or Marco, with news about the parking structure, about Vitali's men, about the machinery of consequences that had been running since the moment he sat on a bar stool in a hotel in New York 2 years ago and made the first in a long series of decisions he could not unmake. He didn't reach for the phone. He reached for his daughter's hand instead, careful and slow, and when her fingers closed around one of his with the total, unearned trust of someone who doesn't know yet what he is, only that he's... Her fingers closed around his and he forgot, for exactly 4 seconds, about everything else. 4 seconds where there was no Vitali, no parking structure, no federal agents moving through a desert hospital complex, no empire dissolving under its own accumulated weight. 4 seconds of a small hand holding one of his fingers with the complete, ignorant trust of someone who has no information about who he is and therefore no reason not to hold on. Then his phone buzzed again, twice in quick succession, and Elena said, "Go!" in a voice like gravel wrapped in exhaustion. Not angry. Just practical. The way she'd always been practical about the parts of his life she couldn't change. "I'll be right back," he said. She didn't answer. She was looking at their daughter with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they'd almost stopped believing they'd reach. He stepped into the hallway and answered the phone. "Parking structure is clear," Carver said. "Reese's people took 3 of them. The other 3 ran. 2 vehicles are still in the structure. Plates are federal now. The 3 that ran... scattered, on foot, into the surrounding streets. Reese has people looking." Carver paused. "Damen. One of them had a phone on him when they took him. Reese's people looked at it before anything else." Another pause, the kind Carver almost never allowed himself. "Vitali had the room number." Damen went still. "He had Elena's room number. Maternity ward, room 11. Someone in the hospital gave it to him." Carver's voice was flat and steady, the way it got when he was managing information that was designed to destabilize. "Reese is already talking to hospital administration." The hallway was ordinary in every way. Pale blue, vinyl floor, a nurse passing with a rolling cart, the sound of a phone ringing at the nurse's station 15 feet away. Ordinary, and suddenly completely wrong. Because someone inside this building had handed Victor Vitali the room number of the maternity ward where Damen's daughter was 3 hours old. "Get someone on her door," Damen said. "Right now. Don't wait for me." "Already done." A beat. "The 3 that ran? They don't have what they came for. Vitali's move failed. But Damen, the 3 that are loose, I know." He thought fast. They're not going to do anything without orders, and Vitaly can't give orders right now because Reese has his men and his phone. Probably. Probably isn't good enough. No, Carver agreed. It's not. He hung up and stood in the hallway for 3 seconds making the calculation. The room, Elena, the door, what was knowable and what wasn't. Then he went back in. Elena looked up from their daughter's face when the door opened, and she read something in his expression before he said a word, because 11 years of reading Damen Moretti's face had given her a fluency in it that even he couldn't fully obscure. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. "Vitaly had your room number." She went very still. One arm tightened slightly around the baby. A reflex, purely physical, the body protecting before the mind has finished processing. "Someone in the hospital," he said. "Reese is already on it. I have a man on your door. Are we safe right now?" "Yes." He said it without hedging because she needed the truth, and the truth happened to be yes, right now, in this moment, yes. The threat was in the parking structure. Reese's people handled it. The men that scattered aren't going to move without orders, and Vitaly can't reach them. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The baby made a small sound between them. Not distress, just presence, just the continuous work of a new person announcing themselves to a room. "You called Reese before all this," Elena said. "You set up the meeting." "Yes." "How much did you offer him?" He held her gaze. "Everything." She absorbed this the way she absorbed most significant information. Slowly, without visible reaction, turning it over in the interior space she'd always kept carefully private from him. "Everything means the organization goes away," she said. "Yes." "And you?" "I'm cooperating fully. What happens to me depends on what Reese can arrange." "What can he arrange?" "Reduce charges, time, probably. I don't know how much, say." He kept his voice level. "I'm not asking you to wait for anything, Elena. I'm not asking you to "I know what you're not asking," she said. "I'm asking what the actual situation is." He sat down in the chair beside her bed because standing over her felt wrong, and he was tired in a way that had moved past physical into something structural. "The situation is that I'm going to hand Reese 23 years of material. He's going to use it to take apart the organization and a significant portion of the political corruption connected to it. In exchange, he's going to make sure you and, he looked at the baby, that you and she have permanent, real protection, federal level, the kind that doesn't evaporate. And you go to prison. Probably. For how long? I don't know yet." He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed contracts and building permits and divorce papers and orders that he was still, in some wordless part of himself, going to have to find a way to live with. "It won't be nothing." Elena was quiet. The baby shifted in her arms, making the small adjustments of someone getting oriented to gravity. Somewhere outside, Arizona was going about its morning, indifferent and enormous. "Her name is Cora," Elena said. He looked up. "I decided 2 months ago." Elena looked down at their daughter. "Cora Vale Moretti. If that's—" She stopped, and the stop was the most vulnerable sound he'd heard from her in years, the sound of someone offering something and not quite finishing the offer. "Cora," he said. The name sat in his mouth like something solid and real. "That's a good name." Reese came to the room 40 minutes later, which was the fastest a federal agent had ever voluntarily entered a maternity ward, and he stood in the doorway with the particular quality of someone who'd been doing a difficult job for 30 years and had learned to read rooms before entering them. He looked at Elena. He looked at the baby. He looked at Damen. His face did something very small and very fast that was almost certainly not compassion, because Reese didn't lead with compassion, but was in the vicinity of it. "We need to talk," he said to Damen, "outside." "Whatever you have to say it here," Elena said. Reese looked at her. She looked back. He must have found what he was looking for, because he came in and stood near the window and said, "We have one of Vitaly's men in custody. He's talking. Not a lot, but enough." He folded his hands in front of him. "Vitaly gave the order last night. The 3 men in the parking structure were supposed to intercept you." He looked at Damen. "When you left the building. Scare tactic. Make you understand the threat was physical and immediate." And the room number, Damen said. Insurance. If the intercept failed, they wanted to know they could reach. Reese didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. It didn't get that far. Where is Vitali now? In Chicago. Reese looked at him steadily. Cooperative people move fast, Moretti. The material you're offering me, I made some calls this morning. My people have been building a case on Vitali for 4 years with about a third of what you could hand us in an afternoon. If your offer is real, I can have men on Vitali's door by tonight. My offer is real. Then I need you in Chicago. Reese paused. Within 72 hours. Elena's head turned toward Damen. He felt it without looking. My daughter is 3 hours old, he said. I know that. I need more time than 72 hours. Moretti, I need 5 days, Reese. 5 days, and I'll walk into whatever office you want, with whatever counsel you want present, and I will hand you 23 years of the cleanest documentation you've ever been given. 5 days. Reese looked at him. He looked at Elena. He looked at Cora, small and oblivious, exercising her lungs in the practiced way of someone who had just discovered lungs and found them satisfying. Something moved across his face again, that thing in the vicinity of something human. 5 days, Reese said, and I want Marco Reyes cooperative and present. He will be, Damen paused. The immunity. Marco's immunity is contingent on full cooperation and testimony. Yours, Reese stopped. I'm going to be honest with you about yours. You're offering significant cooperation that has real value, and it will be reflected in what I can arrange. But I can't promise you anything specific until I see what you actually have. I know. You might still do time. I know. You're okay with that. Damen looked at Cora, at the jaw she'd gotten from him and the eyes she'd gotten from Elena and the small, absolute, unknowing existence of her. No, he said, but I'm doing it anyway. Reese was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 5 days, and walked out. The man who'd given Vitali the room number was an orderly named Glenn Prater, 42 years old, with a gambling debt that had been purchased by people connected to Vitali's network 18 months earlier. He was arrested in the hospital cafeteria at 11 in the morning. He cried when they took him. He said he hadn't known what it was for. He said he thought it was just information, just a room number, just one small thing to clear a debt that was strangling him. Damen heard this secondhand from Carver and said nothing. He understood the mechanism. He'd used variations of it for 20 years. Find the thing a person needs badly enough. Make yourself the solution. Extract the thing you want. It was clean, simple, and required no violence, which made it look, from the inside, like something less than what it was. Glenn Prater had looked at a room number and seen a debt disappearing. He hadn't let himself see the rest. Damen had built an empire on other people not letting themselves see the rest. He had no standing to be angry at Glenn Prater. He told Carver to make sure the man had a lawyer. Carver looked at him with a specific kind of blankness that meant he'd heard the instruction and was choosing not to comment on it. Those 5 days had a texture unlike anything in Damen's previous life. He went back to the rental house. Connie had returned there with Elena and Cora after 36 hours in the hospital. Elena had wanted out, had sat up on the second day and said to the nurse with the particular finality of a woman who was done being a patient, "I'd like to go home now." The house was the same small, dense place it had always been, plants and books and cats, and now there was also a bassinet in the corner of the guest room where Cora slept with the confident commitment of someone who considered sleeping a serious undertaking. Damen visited each morning. He brought coffee and did not ask to come in, and sometimes Connie opened the door, and sometimes she didn't. When she did, he sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee, and sometimes Elena came out, and sometimes she didn't. When she did, they talked. Not about the future, not about Chicago, not about what was coming. About small things. About the way Cora had started tracking light with her eyes. A thing Elena had read about and apparently found remarkable. About Connie's garden. About a road near the edge of town that wound up into the red rocks and was apparently worth the drive. Once, on the third day, he asked Elena how she was sleeping. She looked at him over her coffee cup with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was worth the energy of answering. "In pieces," she said, "the way everyone does with a newborn." "That's normal, I think." "Yes, I know it's normal." She wasn't sharp about it, just accurate. Why are you asking? He thought about the correct answer to that question. Because I wasn't around to ask before. And He stopped. I wanted to ask while I could. She held his gaze for a moment. 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, she said. Cora eats at midnight, 3, sometimes 6. Grandmother takes the 3 o'clock so I can sleep through. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, slightly differently. On the 4th day, Connie came out to the porch while he was sitting with his coffee in the early morning before anyone else was up. She sat down in the other chair, which she'd never done before. She had always maintained a precise position of watchful, but not welcoming, that was communicated entirely through posture. She sat down and she looked at the desert and she said, without looking at him, "She's not going to tell you what she needs. She never learned how." "I know," he said. "That's partly your fault." "I know that too." Connie was quiet for a moment. "When you're gone, when you go back, she's going to pretend she's fine. She's going to be capable of everything because she always is." Connie looked at him now. "And she's going to miss having someone who knows enough about her to see the difference between fine and actually fine." He held the old woman's gaze. "I don't know when I'll be back." "No, you don't." She looked back at the desert. "But you'll be back. If I thought you wouldn't, this conversation would be different." He didn't know what to do with that. He sat with it and drank his coffee, and they watched the desert morning arrive together in something that wasn't quite companionship but was in the same county. He held Cora on the 5th morning. Elena offered her without explanation, simply transferring the bundle from her arms to his with the practical directness of a woman who had decided something and was executing it before she could second-guess the decision. He took her, Cora, with the particular careful terror of someone handling something that cannot be replaced, that has no backup, that is already, inexplicably, more important than anything he'd ever protected in 23 years of protecting things. She was 5 days old. She weighed slightly more than she had at birth because apparently that was a thing that happened. She smelled like the specific clean of something that hasn't been in the world long enough to collect much of it yet. She looked up at him, at the general vicinity of him, because 5-day-old eyes were not entirely committed to focusing, with the expression of someone encountering a new variable and withholding judgment. He looked back at her. He thought about the night in the restaurant, the white tablecloth, and the words he'd said, "Take care of it," and the look on Elena's face that he'd read as compliance, and was actually something else entirely, something more like a woman making a final internal decision about who she was going to be and who she was not. He thought about how close it had come, how one conversation had nearly prevented this exact moment, this small person in his arms, looking at approximately his nose with an openness he did not deserve and had not earned. He thought, "I have to earn it now. That's the only thing left." He held Cora for 11 minutes. He counted. He stood by the window in the small, dense room full of plants and books and morning light and held his daughter for 11 minutes while she made small intermittent sounds and moved her hands the way small hands move when they're learning what hands are for. When he gave her back to Elena, he said, "I have to go tomorrow." "I know," she said. He stopped. The words that came next depended on what was on the other side of Chicago, and he didn't know that yet. "I want to be in her life. However that looks, whatever I can actually offer, from wherever I am. I want to be in it." Elena looked at him. She looked at him the way she had on the sidewalk in the sun, the way she had in the hospital room, with the complete unflinching regard of a woman who had spent 11 years building defenses against him and was now choosing, slowly and deliberately and without any guarantee of outcome, to let some of the structure be permeable. "You should know," she said, "that if you're not consistent, I'm not going to explain you to her. I'll just tell her the truth." "I know. And the truth is not gentle." "I know that too." She shifted Cora to her shoulder and looked at him for one more long moment. "Then be consistent," she said. Like it was simple. Like it was the only thing. Maybe it was. He called Marco that evening. "I need you in Chicago when I get back," he said. "And I need you to be ready to talk to Reese." The pause on the other end of the line was long enough to mean something. "How much talking?" Marco said. Everything. Another pause. Longer. Damen let it run. Marco had known this was coming, had probably known it longer than Damen had, in the way that loyal people sometimes see the shape of things before the person they're loyal to can bear to look at it directly. Okay, Marco said finally. Just that. I'm going to make sure Reese covers you, Damen said. I know you will. A pause. Damen. Yeah. 23 years is a long time. Yes. You good? He stood in the small rental house kitchen in a town in the Arizona desert whose name he now knew, with the sound of Cora somewhere in the next room making the small persistent sounds of a person who exists and intends to continue existing. I think so, he said. Ask me again in a year. Marco made a sound that was almost a laugh. Yeah, he said. Okay. He left before sunrise. He stood on Connie's porch in the dark and knocked softly, because he'd asked if he could say goodbye and Elena had said fine, come before 6. The door opened before he finished knocking, which meant she'd been awake. She stood in the doorway in the blue early dark, holding Cora against her chest, one hand supporting the baby's head, and she looked at him with the expression he'd been carrying in his chest for 5 days, complicated and ongoing and not finished, not by a long distance, but no longer sealed. She's awake, Elena said of Cora. Good morning, he said to his daughter. Cora moved her face toward the sound of his voice with the slow, inexact direction finding of someone learning what sound is and where it comes from. He looked at them, both of them, the composite of them, the thing that existed now and had not existed a year ago and would continue to exist whether or not he was present for it, whether or not he made every choice correctly from here forward. He had missed the beginning. He had nearly prevented the beginning. He had sat in a restaurant and said words that he had spent the last months understanding could not be unspoken, only, maybe, outweighed by the other words, the other choices, the quieter, slower, less dramatic work of showing up and staying and telling the truth and accepting what came back. I'll call, he said. Every few days, Elena said. Not every day. I'll lose my mind. Every few days. She nodded. She looked at him one more time, and the look had something in it that he recognized from the early years, before the empire had fully swallowed him, before the marriage had hollowed out, when there had been moments of genuine recognition between them, the specific quality of two people who actually see each other even when they can't seem to reach each other. She looked at him with something like that. Older, worn through, honest in a way it hadn't been then, but in the same territory. Don't disappear, Damen, she said. Not as a threat, as a need stated plainly. I won't, he said. He touched Cora's hand, one finger, briefly, the way he had in the hospital room. She gripped it with the automatic trust of the brand new. Then she let go, and he let go, and he walked to the car. He drove east. The desert opened up around him, flat and enormous and indifferent, in the way of things that were there before any of this, and would be there after. The sky ahead of him was beginning to move from black toward the very first suggestion of color, still mostly dark, the kind of sky that hasn't committed yet to what kind of day it's going to be. He thought about what was waiting in Chicago. Reese and the meetings and the material he'd accumulated over 23 years that would take, by his estimate, 3 weeks to fully document and hand over. He thought about the legal process after, whatever form it took, whatever number attached to it at the end. He thought about Marco in a federal office somewhere answering questions about a life they'd both lived and were both now, in different ways, attempting to step back from. He thought about Cora's grip, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and a jaw that had come from him, and a grip that didn't know yet not to trust him. The sky went from black to purple, then to gray, then to the particular burned orange of an Arizona morning that he would remember, he suspected, for the rest of his life, with the specific accuracy of mornings that land differently than other mornings. He drove through it, past the gas station where he'd drunk bad coffee and thought about everything, past the diner where he'd first seen Elena across the street, past the edge of the town and onto the highway that stretched east, the way highways stretch when you're not looking back. He handed Reese the first set of documents on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Cora was born. He sat in a federal building in Chicago in a room with no windows, across a table from Reese and 2 other agents and his own attorney, and he laid out 23 years of the Moretti operation with the same methodical precision he'd brought to building it. Accounts, routes, relationships, the names of people in positions they should not have been occupying, the flow of money through structures designed to be difficult to trace, and which he now traced clearly and completely in a room that smelled like bad ventilation and institutional coffee. It took 11 days, not 3 weeks. 11 days because he was thorough and because Reese's people were good and because once a thing is decided, prolonging it serves no one. Marco sat in a separate room down the hall and had his own 11 days with his own set of agents, and they spoke only twice during that period, briefly, in the hallway. And both times said nothing of consequence because everything of consequence was already in the rooms behind them. Victor Vitali was arrested on the 4th day of the documentation process, at 7 in the morning, at a restaurant in Wicker Park where he ate breakfast every Tuesday. His arrest was clean and fast and drew almost no attention, which was exactly the kind of arrest the FBI preferred. He said nothing when they took him. He was, as always, patient. He sat with his lawyers and waited and understood, Damen had to imagine, that the wait this time was not the strategic kind. This was the permanent kind. 3 of Vitali's men, who'd fled the Arizona hospital parking structure, were picked up over the following 2 weeks in places that suggested they'd been moving but hadn't known where they were going. The 4th was never found. Damen suspected he'd gone somewhere genuinely far and had the good sense to stay there. The charges against Damen Moretti were filed on a gray Thursday in November. 12 counts, reduced from the original 23 through cooperation and the specific calculus of what the government needs versus what it has. His attorney argued well. Reese said the things on record that needed saying. The judge was a woman in her 60s who looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that did not suggest she found him interesting or sympathetic, but did suggest she took the paperwork seriously, which was all he'd asked for. 38 months. His attorney said it was exceptional, given the original exposure. His attorney said he should feel relieved. He felt neither relieved nor unrelieved. He felt like a man who had agreed to a price and was now paying it, which was not comfortable but was honest, which was in itself a kind of unfamiliar relief. Marco received immunity. He left Chicago 2 weeks after the sentencing and called Damen once from somewhere he didn't name and said, "You did right." And then, because Marco had never been a man who extended sentiments without embarrassment, "I'm out. Done. Whatever comes next, I'll figure it out." "I know you will," Damen said. "Yeah." A pause. "Take care of yourself in there." "I'll try." "Damen." One more pause, the longest one. "She's a lucky kid. She just doesn't know it yet." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and Marco hung up the way he always hung up, without goodbye, without fanfare, like a man who'd learned that exits were easier when you didn't dress them up. He called Elena every 3 days. She answered most of the time. The calls were short and practical at first. How Cora was eating, how the sleep was, whether she'd heard about the arrest, whether she'd heard about the sentencing. Then, slowly, they became something else. Not warm, exactly. Elena had decided not to rush warmth, and he respected that because she was right. Warmth rushed is warmth performed, and performed warmth was the thing he'd been doing instead of the real thing, for the better part of a decade. But present. The calls became present. She told him things she didn't have to tell him. He told her things he would once have considered private to the point of classified. She told him Cora had laughed, a real laugh, or close enough, at 7 weeks, and described the sound of it with such specific precision that he sat with the phone pressed to his ear and felt something happen in his chest that was not sadness exactly, but was adjacent to it, the particular ache of missing something you're glad exists even though you're missing it. He told her about the nightmares. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You should talk to someone about that." He said he knew. She said, "Not knowing and doing are different things." He said he knew that too. She said, "Damen?" Just his name, the way she said it when she was trying to reach something specific in him. I need you to actually try. Not perform trying, actually try. I know the difference now, he said. Show me then. He did, or he started to. There was a counselor in the facility, a woman named Sandra, who had no patience for self-pity, but considerable patience for the slow and unglamorous work of a person dismantling the architecture of their own avoidance. He sat across from her twice a week and said things out loud that he'd never said out loud, and it felt consistently like pulling something out of concrete with his bare hands. And she consistently seemed to consider this appropriate and insufficient cause for complaint. Cora learned to sit up at 5 months. He knew this because Elena sent a photograph, the first one she'd sent since the hospital, of Cora on the floor of Connie's living room, both hands planted in front of her, concentrating on existing in vertical with the focused intensity she'd apparently inherited and made entirely her own. He had the photograph printed, which required asking a favor, and kept it in his cell, and looked at it the way some men look at maps of places they intend to go. He was released on a Wednesday in early spring, 34 months into the sentence, with 4 months reduced for conduct that apparently surprised the relevant people, though it shouldn't have. He'd always been good at the mechanics of function, even when everything else was broken. He walked out at 7 in the morning with a bag containing the things he'd come in with and nothing else, because he'd arrived with nothing else. The facility was in Illinois, 2 hours south of Chicago. The sky was the particular gray of early March that isn't quite winter, and isn't quite spring, and can't decide. And the air smelled like mud and cold, and something underneath that might have been the specific smell of a season changing its mind. There was no car waiting. He'd been clear about this. He took a bus to a train station and a train to Chicago and sat in the train car watching Illinois go by, flat and brown and wide, fields still pressed down from winter, the occasional farmhouse standing alone in the middle distance like a thought someone had, and then left there. He had an apartment arranged, ground floor, nothing like what he'd had. He'd kept the legitimate assets, 2 commercial properties, a portion of real estate that had been cleanly documented and cleared by the federal process, and let everything else go. It was enough to live on. It was enough to start something different with, if he was careful, and if careful was something he could sustain outside of a context that forced it. He called Elena from the train. She answered on the second ring. He heard Cora in the background. Not crying, just the constant ambient sound of a toddler narrating existence to anyone who would listen. "I'm out," he said. A pause. "How are you feeling?" He thought about it, really thought about it, the way Sandra had trained him to think about things. Not the performed answer, not the useful answer, just the actual one. "Scared," he said, "and like I don't want to waste it." Another pause. "Okay," she said, and then, "Cora, say hi to Daddy." A sound that was not quite a word but was in the direction of one came through the phone, accompanied by what sounded like the impact of small hands on something flat. "Hi," he said, to the sound of his daughter. "I'm coming to see you. Is that okay?" More non-word sounds. Elena said, in the background, "She says yes, obviously." He looked out the train window at the flat brown fields of Illinois, at the gray, uncertain sky above them, at the specific light of an early March morning that didn't know yet what it was going to be. He was 47 years old. He had 34 months behind him, and the rest of it ahead of him, and the rest of it looked nothing like what had come before, which was terrifying, and also, specifically and undeniably, exactly what he'd traded everything for. "I'll be there Thursday," he said. "I'll tell grandmother," Elena said. "She'll make something." I know you don't need it. She'll make it anyway. That's what she does." A pause. And in the pause, he could hear Elena deciding something, the familiar microbeat of her internal machinery arriving at a conclusion. "Damen." "Yeah." "Thursday's good," she said. It was not forgiveness. He was under no illusions about that. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would come the way everything real came, slowly, in the texture of ordinary days, in the accumulated weight of consistent small choices made without audience or reward. It would come or it wouldn't, and he was not entitled to it either way. And he knew that now in his body rather than just in his head, which was the only kind of knowing that actually changed how a person moved through the world. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the fields. They were already changing, already, even in the gray early light, Something in the brown was shifting towards something that might become green, the buried and incremental work of a season that had been gathering itself through the cold months without being visible about it. The train moved. Chicago came closer. The sky stayed gray and was not beautiful, and was also exactly what it needed to be, which was simply the sky above the next thing, waiting to see what he'd do. He sat up straighter in his seat. He folded his hands in his lap. He thought about a yellow dress and bare feet on porch steps. He thought about a photograph of Cora on a living room floor, concentrating on vertical. He thought about a grip that didn't know not to trust him, and the long, specific, entirely his own work of becoming someone who deserved it. The train ran north. He let it carry him, for once not managing the direction, not calculating the destination, just moving toward the only thing that had ever successfully broken through the architecture of everything he'd built to keep himself alone. Which was, it turned out, exactly enough.